So, Gävle University. I guess that a lot of you have not visited our campus. So I have here a picture from above of our campus. In the middle there is our library, which we're very proud of, which is a good place where students meet and can sit down and discuss with each other and also meet teachers and other staff. This university is actually built in the place of an old military regiment that was closed down in the 70s and then converted into the university buildings. So the buildings are old and with very thick stone walls, preserving the knowledge that we create. Then why do we have this seminar on critical thinking? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. If we look at the EEG graduate attributes, one of the general competences that we aim for our students to acquire is competences around critical thinking. So in that perspective, we also need to think about how do we teach critical thinking to our students, and how do we put it into a perspective of sustainability. And that was our sort of way into this masterclass seminar. And I think it also is nice that we can, at least from our point of view, start at the general competences, and then perhaps during this long and fruitful seminar series we can dive into the other graduate attributes in this that we have agreed upon. So this is the way into this seminar. Also, I think that should we have some questions after each presentation, Caroline, Rick, and Johan, or do you want to say them
No, I
today?
think we do them at the end, because we've also sort of linking to each other and so on. So even if we are 3 people presenting, think of it as a one presentation.
Yeah. Good. So by those words, I leave the floor to Caroline and Rick to begin, and then Johan will follow. So Caroline, please.
Yes, thank you. We should just find the presentation and load it. I think it's below, darling. There. Good. So welcome to this seminar. My name is Caroline Sims, and I work here at the University of Gävle as a lecturer primarily in English and in English didactics, involved in teacher training. My PhD is in education, though. It's in pedagogy, and I've particularly looked at the inclusion of gifted students in education. But I also have a background in philosophy and in working for the International Baccalaureate, where we have a module for critical thinking. And this is also where I've joined up with my husband, Rick Sims, who can introduce himself.
Hello, yes, I'm Rick Sims. So we're a husband and wife duo in all this. My background is in a number of things, but I think what I bring to the table here is as a philosopher of mind, philosopher of cognitive science. I'm interested in extended cognition and distributed cognition, and that's the idea that that thinking can happen not just inside the head, but also in the environment and distributed amongst different people. So the idea that thinking is not an internal thing, but it's an external thing. And then the other thing I bring to the table is that I have, for the last 25 years, been training teachers in a subject called Theory of Knowledge in the IB program, which is a critical thinking course.
Good. So we move on to our presentation then, and we would like to start by mentioning something about the big picture here. And that is, of course, critical thinking in itself is a large concept, and we got many different ideas of what it is and what it includes and so on. But the way we think about it here is that critical thinking, as it says in the slide here, underlies sustainable thinking and living, of course. At the same time as we can also see that the weaknesses in critical thinking underlie non-sustainable forms of life, because it's also to do with a certain type of awareness, and awareness of what choices we make and on what conditions we make those choices. The first part here, it has as its aim then to try to dismantle this from this quite large metastructure of an idea of what we ought to do when we teach, to make it a little bit more concrete, and then to see how can we actually approach this in teaching independently of level of education and actually also subject disciplines. That one?
That one.
That one. Thank you. So critical thinking then and higher education, as Fredrik showed, it's part of the EU Green idea as well of what we mean by education and so on. But we can also see that if we're looking at more sort of local documents, it's a defining condition in higher education. It's part of what we do and part of what we teach. And it also this idea of, instead of it being this sort of and a sort of abstract idea of what it is, we think of it as an attitude, an epistemic virtue, rather than a specific procedure of what you do. And that is also why, you know, we say that it's part of thinking rather than something abstract in that way. Because what we have also noticed through our experience of teaching is that students often do not understand the nature of the conceptual resources used in constructing knowledge. They become quite dependent on the sources, and they become dependent on models and definitions without the ability of actually standing on the side of those and actually looking at them again critically, which is what we says here, it results in fractured and superficial understanding. And in particular, what we approach in this idea is the idea of teaching critical thinking pedagogy using Socratic dialogue. So the aim here of the presentation, but also of our research work, including this strategies in teaching, is again to approach this as an attitude. What is that we can do to nurture critical thinking in university classrooms, and the idea of asking questions rather than giving answers. What is the status of X? What kind of thing is it? What is the cognitive purpose of X? What kind of problem does it solve? And what assumptions is this idea, concept, purpose resting on? Again, rather than teaching linear definition answer type of thinking. So I've already said it's a kind of process, and we're going to bring to you two examples from our teaching. My example comes from the courses I teach in translation, which also then brings in this intercultural aspects of the EU Green commitment. Not just what kind of problem does cultural translation seek to solve? Well, we find it problematic sometimes to actually translate certain words, because with the word comes also a deeper understanding of the meaning of that word. So again, it doesn't work like definition, question, answers type of thinking. Do you want to say something about the second example there?
Yes, I'm going to take an example from economics. I have taught economics before, but it's not my main subject. But I chose this specifically because it has some fairly obvious links with sustainability. And what I'm going to argue is that non-critical thinking, so perhaps what we might call first order teaching, brings with it a sort of acceptance of a framework, a conceptual framework, which, if it's not questioned, can lead to the kind of non-sustainable situations that we find. So the model I chose here to have a look at is a fairly simple model, and you don't need to worry if you're not familiar with it, because in a sense, it's not the economics that's important here, but the actual what's actually going on in the pedagogy. But it's what we call the input-output model of production. And what I'm going to look at is what conceptualizations are involved in that, what's taken for granted. And what is taken for granted are usually not factual in the sense of, pertaining to the world, but it's what's taken for granted is ways of thinking about the world. And what I want to do is to say, well, we should sometimes problematize those ways of thinking. And what I'm going to say here is that quite often I've experienced that economics classes are reductive and they tend to isolate a firm from its environment. And that's precisely the problem that we might come across when we're looking at questions of sustainability.
Good. So move on to my first example then, a course in translation. And could you move those things that's on the screen there? So you can't, okay.
Here we are.
So cultural translation as the concept to be learned. When I work on translation in my courses, it's of course a mixture of different things going on. We have things to do with semantics, so what is the meaning of a certain word, but also linking into pragmatics, meaning how is it actually used? And the interpretation then is, of course, dependent on a number of things. What is the cultural context surrounding this word? What is the historical context, which, of course, sometimes is very difficult to trace, because it's very difficult if we look at very old translations of old texts, for example, that specific meaning and weight were given to certain concepts that we might have lost along the way. That is, of course, a very complex thing to do. And we also have the emotional content of certain words. And of course, when we're looking at translations of poetry, there's also the onomatopoeic aspects, the phonological components of the sound of certain words. How can that be translated? And of course, we also have the sociolinguist components. If we're talking about translating a text which includes a dialogue, we have a character of a certain age, ethnicity, gender of the speaker, and so on. So all of this means that there's quite a lot of aspects of language that needs transferring into that translation. And of course, as we know now, there's a number of translation tools. They're very happy to help us in doing this. But the problem is, of course, that they don't actually have the sense of these aspects, which means that we are not really happy with the outcome of those type of translations. Could you change us? Thank you. So this is an example. It's taken from a book on some old Christmas traditions in Sweden, where it used to be a creature who delivered presents on Christmas Eve instead of the now Father Christmas. And it was this type of creature, which in Swedish is called a julbock. So we were working on this text with students, and I was saying then, so how did you translate julbocken in this text about Swedish Christmas traditions? Student says, we wrote the Christmas goat. Oh, but that doesn't make sense to somebody who doesn't understand the culture. They probably know what a goat is, and they know what Christmas is, but not a Christmas goat. So how can this be sold? Well, we wrote to the billy goat. That way we would understand that it's a goat and it has horns, but we left out Christmas. So in what way does that change its meaning? Well, we lose the connection to Christmas. We could say the Christmas devil, because that is actually what it was meant to illustrate, or Yule devil, to make it more historical. That would suggest that the way it looked with horns, that it was meant to be something frightening, but how about the goat part? Well, we could coin a new word, devil goat. So perhaps the Yule devil goat, but it sounds too long. And that was my example. So now I pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caroline. So as you can see, we're starting off with examples because I think Johan is going to build on this and talk more generally about organizational and structural issues. But we're starting with examples because a lot of these concepts that we're dealing with when we're looking at critical thinking are somewhat nebulous, and I think it's really important to to put some actual flesh on them in terms of examples. So I want to talk about what I understand to be second order thinking, and I use that term, and I use that term with teachers as well, to be honest. So let's start off with, we're trying to make knowledge about the world. That's what we're trying to do, aren't we, at in university level, school level, everyday life level. We're trying to make sense of this world. So let's talk about what happens in the world as being what I call the zeroth order. There's stuff happening in the world. And then, of course, we make knowledge about that. And we can then say we're sort of one step removed from the world now. We're making knowledge about the world. Knowledge there are lots of metaphors for knowledge. We could think of knowledge as being sort of an inner notebook where we write things down, or we can think of knowledge as being a map of what goes on there. We could think of knowledge as being a story. So it's got a sort of chronological structure to it. Or we can think of knowledge as being the ability to do stuff in the world, the ability to get around the world. I call that the maze metaphor because it's like a mouse running a maze. But the point is that this first order knowledge about the world is not the same as the world. It's an abstraction. It's a simplification. It's something that we make that allows us to do things in the world. And being finite human beings, it needs to be simple. And that's interesting because students quite often think that knowledge has to be accurate and therefore accurate in every detail. And if you think about a map, we want the map to be simple because we want to be able to use it. And a map that was accurate in every detail would not be very easy to use. And there's a wonderful story of Borges about the map being the same as the territory and one-to-one map of the territory. And of course, it becomes completely impractical and doesn't serve as a map. So that's the first level, and there's some abstraction involved in that already. And I think a lot of teachers teach at this level, and they teach the map. But of course, there's one thing we realize about maps, and that is that the same territory can have many maps. And there are lots of ways of mapping the world. And sometimes we talk about that as being conceptualizations or conceptual frameworks. There are different ways of looking at the world. We can cut up the world in different ways. And so what I'm arguing is that what I call second order thinking, and that's what I'm trying to hint at, this is where maybe critical thinking comes in. Second order thinking is to have a look at that knowledge that we make of the world from, if not a critical perspective, at least an awareness that there are different ways of doing things. So we might ask questions about, what concepts are we using, and what do these do? Why are they useful? How are they effective? Are they effective? And maybe there is an alternative way of looking at things using alternative conceptualization. Now, concepts already are a difficult idea, aren't they? I mean, what is a concept? But I would say that concepts are something like when you place a lot of individual phenomena under a single heading. So it's grouping things together because they are alike in some ways. And I think that map analogy works very well. We group some things together. We conceptualize the world because we're interested in, let's say, in roads, how they join together, or railway lines, how they join together. And we ignore everything else. So when we make knowledge about the world, we are selective like that. And that's through our conceptualizations. So what I want to show is how to compare two kinds of teaching here. And I've got two examples. And they're made up examples, but and again, don't worry about the technical details. I think the important thing is that we realize that there's two ways of doing things. So I'm trying to move on the slide. Oh, just before I get there, just very quickly. So the second order thinking is characterized not about rehearsing not first order claims, but thinking about knowledge, right? So thinking about the nature of knowledge. And that means, as I said, reflecting on the status, the function, the conceptualization of these claims.
Which is like in the translation example. It's all of these things going on, isn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly. All the things that you were mentioning. And it could mean that we also reflect on the role that each of those components, for example, in the translation, play. And also things like models and maps. How, what is the relation between our knowledge of the world and the world itself? And like I say, I did hint at it could mean that we adopt a critical attitude towards a particular conceptualization, right? So we don't just take for granted what's been presented in the textbook or what's been presented in a way of thinking as being the only way of thinking about it. And for me, that's the key idea. We adopt a critical stance towards things. So this is the economic model that I'm going to talk about, and it's very simple. The idea is you have a firm, and a firm is like a company, and it produces something, and it takes inputs from the environment basically, and it produces a finished product that goes into the environment. And the inputs are typically labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship, and the finished product is taken to be the output. So this is what students might learn if they were doing pre-university economics, certainly in the IB and in a lot of national systems as well. And it's a very simple model, as you can see. Now, what I want to do is to showcase a couple of ways in which a teacher could teach this stuff. So here's the first one. And I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with this, right? This is what I call competent teaching. But it is, I would argue, it's first order. So we got the lecturer saying, you know, we're going to have a look at the model of the firm. It's called the input-output model. What are the inputs into the production process? And the student answers, well, they're labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship. And then lecturer says, okay, so what is capital? So it's taking one part of this conceptualization and asking the students to sort of refine it. There are two types of capital: fixed capital, plant machinery, and variable capital like raw materials and energy. Sorry, going ahead of myself. Okay, so what is the output of this production process? It's a finished product. And what's the aim of the firm? Well, this is going a little bit further, but the firm is aiming to maximize profit. And if I just go underwater here, so this is what happens in the actual classroom, but going underwater, seeing what is the thinking behind this, so the motivation for each of these interactions. So the first one, announcing the aims of the learning engagement. Then we're looking at first order knowledge about the world, and the lecturer is probing whether the student has knowledge about the model, right? So this is interesting that this is not factual stuff really, but it's factual stuff about the model that we traditionally use. So we're asking questions about the conceptualization. And then further on, when the lecturer asks, well, what is capital? It's asking the students now to define a concept. It's first order process. And then when the student says, well, there are two types, then the student is doing something, I think, sophisticated, refining that concept into subtypes, and so on and so forth. So I think towards the end, the teacher is doing something interesting. What is the aim of the firm? You know, do you notice that was not on the diagram? And what's going on here is that the lecturer is probing the hidden characteristics of this particular model. And I would argue that's getting towards second order stuff, actually. But I would argue that we could do better than this, right? So what I'm going to say is, yeah, this is not bad, but I think we can do better. So here's another go at it. So this is what I call critical thinking pedagogy. So we're going to look at the input-output model. What are the inputs into? So the first part is the same. But when we get to this point here, why are these inputs? Why are these inputs? And the lecturer is now drawing attention to the construction of the model, but it's a sort of stealthy reference here.
In comparison to the last example, when it was asking something more factual.
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't do the coloring here. So these red things are the underwater motivations. Why are these inputs? Because they originate in the environment outside the firm, considered to be a black box. Now, of course, we've got a very bright student who says this, and I made the students really bright just to illustrate. But the point is, there's a subtle thing here that we're thinking of the firm as being different from the environment. And just from a sustainability point of view, this might be problematic, mightn't it? So then the lecturer wants to problematize this a little bit. And so how realistic is it to think of the firm isolated from its environment? And so we're still exploring the model, but possibly we're looking now at the limitations of the model. And the student says, well, it's not at all realistic. It's actually one big system. Again, this is another very bright student who's seeing the limitations and seeing that this reductive model maybe is not very helpful. And the students latching on to what we might think of as being problems with the model. And then the lecturer wants to take that further. What are the dangers in pretending that the firm is a black box isolated from its environment? Now, it's an explicit question asking the student to make visible what are these limitations. And again, our bright students are saying, well, one danger is that we do accounting merely from the firm's point of view. So profit is just purely revenue minus costs. And costs that are outside the firm, such as, the deleterious effects of the firm's production on the environment, are not taken into account. So the student is getting to what we might call, in our teacherly way, we might call a reductive nature of this particular model. And then I think the teacher, the lecturer wants to really hammer this home, right? So you want to make this visible, you want to make this completely explicit in the learning situation. Does the model lead us to think of the situation in a particular way? And now the lecturer is really pushing the students to spell out, okay, so what are this particular way of conceptualization? Why is it problematic? And the student, I get the student to say this, but of course you can imagine this will probably take a whole lesson to get here. But by thinking of the firm isolated from the environment, we're likely to ignore the effects of the firm on the environment. So for me, the big takeaway here is that by critical thinking, which means also being critical towards the conceptual schemes that we use, we can also be critical of the sort of conceptual schemes that perhaps have led to a growth in what we roughly speaking can call non-sustainable ways or forms of life.
And thinking.
And thinking. Yeah, well, the thinking leads to action. That's what I'm trying to say. So our conclusions really is that what we call critical thinking pedagogy involves extensive use of these second order questions. And they create a space in which the students can critically evaluate our methods of analysis. They don't just take the methods of analysis as being given, but can be critical towards them. And then, insensitivity to issues of sustainability, you could argue, can be traced back to the use of a first order pedagogy where we accept, classical economics and the sort of categories that they use. So that critical thinking pedagogy can solve this. And then second order questions can also be used to facilitate differentiated teaching and adaptive learning in a class or a seminar which supports the development of many different kinds of student. And I think that's something that we're also interested in, although we have not said so much of that now.
And what we're trying to say also in this very, very compressed time that we have to actually develop this is, like I said at the introduction, that these type of questions, these type of dialogues can actually then be used independently of what discipline we teach, because there would always be, like we said, concepts and models and conceptualization. They're always things to question rather than just teaching them, like you're saying, first order, this means this, use it in this way, but actually then going back, questioning on what grounds, why, motivate it, because that's where we believe also that understanding comes in. And I think, do we have one more slide here?
No, I think that's us.
Okay, if you press on let's see, because we have something about the role of the teacher. No, that's been taken out. So the role of the teacher in here is, of course, then to, like we said, not actually to give so many answers, but actually rather to ask questions. Because again, we are not just rapidly going along with what the students say, but we actually go back the whole time and say, but hang on what grounds? Why do you think that? Why is that the case? And even if that might seem like it's actually taking valuable time away from teaching, we would say that it is actually the investment into their thinking that's actually leading them forward. So it means that we're actually moving them forward by going back. Thank you. We would like to pass over then to Johan.
While Johan is setting up, I can ask you to please write in chat what university you are coming from. You can either use the short things or write the whole university name, so we get a track of this, where you're from. We were actually going to try to do a survey, but Zoom is not so helpful when different presenters are trying to do things. Yes, please write it sometime during the rest of the seminar. Was someone wanted to ask a question? Or
We take questions at the end, Fredrik.
Right.
Now
Question
we
at
want
the
to hear
end?
Johan.
you want to hear Johan? Let's go, Johan.
You're muted, Johan. Yeah.
Okay, so we need to
of
unmute.
course.
we
It
probably
will be a very short seminar.
Oh, now I'm muted.
Thank you, Johan.
With the help of Fredrik. Thank you very much.
Caroline, will you make him co-host?
Could you do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
There.
So
Good.
I'm going to continue by presenting a European research project about innovative thinking in work life. And I will try as best as I can to relate to this notion of second order thinking. So here is my slides then. So, well, to think innovatively in working life, it's related to many things, as I will address soon, but not least, it is about the changing context and the challenges that professionals meet when context in work life changes. And I will give you some example about how teachers deal with changes and how they are relating to such changes in work life in an innovatively kind of way. So simply, I'm going to present this study in light of Caroline's and Rick's lecture here. So my example is taken from Swedish preschool teachers and European teachers in general. In the case of Sweden, there has been a change in policy for preschool teachers to go from play pedagogy to teaching subject knowledge to small children. And in this context, the preschool teachers have to rethink their own practices. They cannot choose to just continue with asking the same kinds of education didactical questions as before. So they have to kind of standing, as Caroline said, beside their practice and beside the former practices and beside their former thinking. They have to decentrate. So this is not least due in this example to changed policies. And we find this changed policy all over work life. When professionals cannot just rely on their established knowledge, based on evidence and best practices and so on is not enough. And you cannot just rely on this kind of knowledge in order to deal with all the changes. For example, which I mentioned here, the Swedish preschool teachers changed context here. So this is about innovative second-order thinking in work life and what makes this possible in organizational life. And I will return to the role of the university teaching at the end of this presentation. Mainly, I will base my presentation on this book, Characteristics and Conditions for Innovative Teachers, International Perspectives. This book is based on researchers within 16 European Union countries. And we tried to catch teachers which were recognized as innovative teachers and which are doing good practice, which are recognized by colleges as innovative. And we tried then to map up characteristics, the characteristics of how these teachers think and deal with problems. So we find both attitudes and cognitive dimensions. And I can mention about attitudes. As you see, there are as much as 10 kinds of different attitudes. Open to new ideas and approaches, collaborative mindset. They are curious, risk takers, solution focused, they are perseverance oriented, adaptive, flexible, courageous too, bold and inspirational. So you see that there are also a set of attitudes related to innovative thinking, which is not only cognitive. But when you come to the cognitive aspects, you find thinking outside the box, being creative thinking, a problem solver, adaptive and flexible thinking, reflexive and analytical. And if you try to relate this to the first lecture here, we can see that there is an overlap between the cognitive characteristics and the second order thinking characteristics. Yes. And we could claim then that in order to facilitate these kinds of abilities in work life, teaching second order thinking is important. The university teaching can prepare leaders, teachers, people with important responsibility to develop work life through teaching this second order thinking. And that is also something we find in our interviews. People talked about important teachers at the university and writing essays and dealing with theories and so on. So we have this connection in our data too. So this is not just a way of doing a synthesis with a previous lecture. You also have conditions for being innovative in the organization, and that is really important because this is not only about having a mindset inside you. You also interact with your environment in order to be a problem solver, a creative thinker, and to deal with change context. And this was in the data of the project the most important conditions. Firstly, supportive leadership, and the possibility to have a professional autonomy. Third, appreciation from the colleges, and not least the leadership, for developing to think innovative and develop new ideas outside the box. Time allocated for innovative thinking is not something that just pops up during work, but you have to provide times in order to make it possible to stand beside, as Caroline mentioned, that demands a certain allocation of time, which is also related to decisions from the leadership. Different kind of resources, it could be digital resources and other kinds of resources connected to your close environment, like buildings, or how rooms are designed, and so on. And also funding, economical funding, because funding is, of course, related to the dimensions I just mentioned here. Also, a very important condition is collaboration and teamwork, because when you discuss things in teams with your colleagues, you develop ability to listen to your own thoughts and to discuss and to decentrate from your own thoughts too. Of course, that demands that your team is also directed toward this second order thinking. In our Swedish study, we found that there was a certain group called development leaders who had especially been provided with this. But this result here is not only taken from our Swedish case, it's from all of the Europe collected in this book. So, as a way of a summary and perhaps a little bit of a synthesis then, you could say that second order thinking is important for innovativeness. And as I just mentioned, the role of the university is important in order to facilitate this kind of characteristics, to nurture these characteristics in work life, professional skills. And the competence is about to rethink when the context changes, when the environment changes. It could be a changed market, it could be changed environments, as Rick mentioned. It could be about changed policies, and that is not least important for teachers. So we should teach them for supportive leadership in critical thinking. When we educate when we educate leaders with certain positions like principals and so on, we should make them aware of this dimension, about these conditional dimensions. If I would compare my presentation with Caroline's and Rick, I would say that for them it is about to try to sketch or to define clear demarcations about what characterizes second order thinking. However, this explorative approach can be seen as a complement to what they label as second order thinking. I could also add this here, that cognitive challenges should not be compensated with innovative attitudes. Attitudes is not enough, but attitudes interact on a psychological level with the cognitive skills. So my least comment here is that sustainability, it depends on these abilities, because work lives are changing, and in order to change, deal with these changes, you have to develop some kind of innovative and second order thinking in order to achieve a sustainable work life. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan.
Thank you. We will open up for questions. I will now allow you to activate your own microphone, but please raise your hand before you want to ask a question. Yes, we have first question. Maria?
Yeah. Well, good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for the presentation. It was very challenging for us to work together also. Well, my question is for Rick. Rick, you mentioned that thinking is an external thing and that thinking is on the environment. Could you please develop a bit more this idea? It's very important for me.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria. Yeah, this is this has been an idea that's been around for about 3 or 4 decades. But there's a Swedish philosopher called Bo Dalbom, and he said, and I think it's a wonderful quote. He said, "You can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, and you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. And by that, I think he means that if we look around us, just look around your environment now, you will see that there are many tools around you that we use for thinking, and they are there in the external environment. So, for example, when I'm writing a paper, I don't just write the paper in my head and then just splurge it out like a printer would do on a computer. When I'm writing the paper, I might have some notes, I might have other papers with around me. I'm interacting with what I've already written, and especially nowadays with technology, we can sort of sketch stuff and we can go back to what we were thinking, and so there's an ongoing interaction there. And that's with material stuff in the environment. And it's not just in terms of this linguistic kind of knowledge that we would have in, say, an academic paper. But if you imagine a sculpture with a piece of stone, sculpting that piece of stone, they are also thinking in a way, and they're thinking with their hands, they're thinking with the stone, and the stone is also presenting itself to them with many possibilities for action. So it's an interaction between the sculpture and the stone. It's not just happening in the sculpture's head, and I'm going to now realize my inner vision. There will be an inner vision, but that inner vision will, of course, be modulated, tempered by the stone in front of her. So that's what I mean. So the idea, and there was a famous paper in 1998 by Clark and Chalmers called The Extended Mind, where they thought of things like notebooks as being extensions of our thought capacities. And philosophically, the background is functionalism. If you define mind by what it can do, then you could argue that a notebook plays much the same role as our biological memory does. But I'm thinking more in more sort of general terms. So when you're playing a game of chess or something, we do depend on the chessboard to help trigger our thought processes, and quite often we're thinking with what's in front of us. So that's what I mean by the environment playing a role. And I think Johan said something interesting in his talk about the material environment and the layout of classrooms and so on, and what rooms look like. And I think that's a really important feature as well, that if we accept that not only do we think using tools in the environment, but we might think collectively as well. So we might have a situation in the classroom where we're co-constructing knowledge, where our thought processes are distributed across many individuals. Then how the environment is set out is really important. And there's a lot of work that's been done on how do you set out a classroom? What's a good way of doing it? And that has changed over my lifetime quite heavily, from lines of seats to sort of more clusters. Yeah. But that's my take on it. And what I'm interested in particularly is what does that tell us about the nature of the thought process? That's where my actual philosophy research has been going. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question, Maria. In again, a long thought in a short format. Do we have any more questions or comments?
I have a question for the three of you. You have been talking about the content in teaching now. How about assessment when it comes to critical thinking and second order thinking?
When I've been teaching philosophy, I have actually used these type of dialogues as assessment. So instead of saying, tell me what Plato in the Republic says about the state, whatever, they have got the task of actually constructing a dialogue where they are then naturally arguing with pros and cons because they represent different characters, where it's much easier than to sort of, instead of where it looks like you're arguing against yourself, it's of course the character carrying that idea. And it was quite successful. It borders creative writing, of course, and that's the challenge with it, that students sort of go off track. But I think it could definitely think about, do we always need to ask the students to write essays? Do we always need to, have that type of tests? Can we use these type of dialogue as a form of assessment? That's what I would say. I don't know if Johan and Rick wants to add to that. No?
I'm fine. Yeah, that's a good answer.
Yeah.
Okay, Paolo.
Good. Hello, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. Um, my question is also about assessment of the practice. Do you have data or based on your experience, could you tell us about your what are the main change, affective main change and behavioral main change of your students after these practices?
Well, if I could start to say something, I would say to begin with, they are massively frustrated, at least some of them, because they don't want to question. They haven't got the time to question. You know, give me the answer, stop causing a fuss. And when you keep on doing that as a teacher, they realize that, okay, it doesn't matter that I complain. This is where we are now. This is where we're going. So I actually have to start to do some thinking here. And then some students are really invigorated by this because they've been sort of waiting for it. They are not definitely first order question oriented students. They are just dying to have this type of teaching where you actually get to do some work. And I think the other category, once they get going, they are also quite happy at the sort of end, even if they're frustrated to begin with. So that's definitely a change that I have noticed in having, keep on being this, difficult teacher who's just keep on saying, well, how do you know? What do you mean? Where do you go with this? Instead of saying, yes, good, thank you, next question. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there are costs to this method, and one of the costs is that you need to prepare, I think, quite well. At least if you've in the beginning, you need to think about because you have to think on your feet quite a lot, and you have to think about the sort of questions that's going to open up ideas for students, and you have to do that quickly. So when you're training teachers, which is what I have spent a lot of time doing, my advice is always for the teacher to try and think through these different pathways and actually prepare questions beforehand, when they're not confident. So there is a cost to it, but behaviorally, in terms of actual students, I think, as you say, I mean, I think there are massive payoffs. And I do see a different, slightly more reflective kind of behavior. But it takes a long time. I mean, I think I don't like this distinction between skills and knowledge, but I think these are what traditionally might be thought of as skills. They are what I call epistemic virtues. They are, and like Greek virtues, you have to practice them to get them right. So it takes time. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but there was a question in the chat. Did you see that? Sorry,
Paolo.
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat about our research methodology. It says something like,
so go on another question.
Okay,
sorry. Thank you, Paolo.
There's a question from Thinley Wangbo. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question to Rocking Duo, Rick and Caroline, could you please share more on your research methodology? Is it experimental? So what I want to say here is that at the moment, we're very in the early stages of this research, and it's very much a proof of concept. So it's very much based on our own experiences. Caroline is the expert on doing this sort of research, and we want to take it further. But at the moment, it's a concept, and we're putting it out. And in fact, some of the feedback that you're giving us is going to be very helpful in where we take this.
But I would say also in reply to that, I would say that's in the pipeline, definitely, to do some sort of experimental testing of a sort of before and after and so on. But as we know, with all research to do with education and learning, it is so difficult to say that it is a particular change that actually causes, has a particular consequence, because we're looking for also long-term long-term consequences. But that's where we also have a body of students from the, like we say, from International Baccalaureate, who've been doing all of these things as part of their education. They moved on to university and they now have very interesting jobs, many of them. And in again, anecdotal, they have been coming back to us saying, you know, it was that course that actually made a big difference for me. So that is, of course, also very interesting to follow up on. I think we have another question from Hugh McBride.
Yeah, I really thanks a million for the presentation. I kind of agree very much with the idea of critical thinking as being an attitude or an epistic virtue. I think that's really good. I think you used the idea about nurturing critical thinking skills, and I think that's the way to go for sure. I was just very curious, but about the validity of the opening assertions that you made in terms of critical thinking, where you said critical thinking underlines sustainable thinking and living. That I can agree with. But the second sentence, I think, is nearly contrary to the whole idea of what you're doing, which is that weaknesses in critical thinking underlie non-sustainable forms of thinking. That in itself is questionable because it's conceptually loaded, and even in terms of translating what those words actually mean in English, never mind into a foreign culture. So it was just a curious thing that struck me. It seemed contrary to the spirit of what you're doing otherwise.
So I will answer that because I'll take ownership of that
Statement.
claim. Yeah. So in a sense, I was being provocative, and I wonder whether it's entirely justified. But I was trying to be provocative and suggest that let's just take my example, the economics example. So when I was teaching economics in the IB, the textbook was very much along the lines of, you know, the theory of the firm, classical economics, very reductive.
Oh gosh, Russell.
Oh, mute Russell.
Yeah.
And the theory of firm was very much this reductive. Let's reduce it to the firm's point of view, and let's sort of basically cancel the environment from that way of thinking. Now, I would argue that if you're not critical towards that conceptualization, you could be tempted to think that that was a good way of analyzing an economic situation. And I'm trying just to be a little bit provocative here and say, well, wonder whether some of our problems that we've got ourselves into in terms of what we've done to the environment can be traced back to a type of economic thinking that thinks in these very reductive both in terms of place and time, you know, so we're looking at short-term and localized situations. And if we had a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations of students who were prepared to question those things and say, well, hang on, is this a good analysis? Then maybe, you know, and I just say maybe here, I'm not going to say this is the case, but maybe that type of thinking would have avoided some of these. So that's what I was trying to hint at. But I agree, it's overclaimed to be a little bit provocative.
And wonderful that you spotted that, Hugh. It's good. Good that we have a critically thinking audience very clearly. I think we have one more question, and then, I mean, we are already a little bit over time, and we are very, very happy that you all turned up. And if people have to leave, we understand that. But I am definitely prepared to take the last question as well. So let's hear from Wang Shuk, I believe your name is.
Hello, Wang Chuk from Bhutan. So my question is, if you look at the slides, the basic conditions for innovation, so especially for developing countries like Bhutan or any other in the region, includes like the condition is funding, resource, and the autonomy. Now, Kesar Gelpo University is a public funded, government funded. So where all these are some sort of barriers. So can you share some promising practices or effective interventions that is, effective in addressing innovation related issues in resource constant setting. Yeah.
Perhaps
I
if,
think that's for, I think, yeah, that's for you, Johan. Yes.
Yes. I think, unfortunately, this may depend a little bit about key players. I could see that when certain leaders or responsible person has been changed, the conditions have been weakened actually. But I think what you can do is to point at good examples and say that this is resources that we are in need of, simply.
Thank you, Johan.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll have to end the seminar now. Some of us have to have some lunch. Others have to do teaching. Some lucky people will perhaps do some research. Thank you very much for participating. We look forward to the next masterclass seminars, which is going to be in... Where is it going to be?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. I've forgotten. It will be announcements coming up soon from the organizers.
That's right. We should keep our eyes open.
Keep your eyes open.
Thank you again so much, everyone, for
Thank you
attending.
very much.
Fantastic.
And if you want to get in contact with Caroline, Sims, or Johan, you can ask your local coordinators at your universities, so they can help with that.
That's right. And of course, I can pass on anything to Rick as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.